Wow. What an honor and privilege. Thank you, Peter. Fred, thank you for having me here at Ashland, a very, very special university. I heard about Ashland from way, way back. I didn't go to Ashland because I couldn't get into Ashland. Probably still couldn't get into Ashland today. I'm not sure how Rex got into Ashland, though. The guy who was the first Ashland scholar is actually very involved and has been involved in every single one of my campaigns. And I don't know if that was a mistake or how he got in, but anyhow, I'm amazed. But I am thankful that you invited me here today because this is awfully special and really, really a privilege. And it's been a privilege to have parts of Ohio that have not been part of my district, part of the new 12th district that I'm running in. And I've been really made feel at home by the chairman of the Richland County Party, Barbara Walters, who is here, and Marv Krinsky, who is obviously very active in the Ashbrook Center, and Roger, who obviously has a lot to do with all the good things that happen around here with Peter. And so I really, really feel blessed to be welcomed here as I have. And then to have Tom Whatman here, a big shot with Speaker Boehner, the guy who actually is Speaker John Boehner's right hand when it comes to campaigns and political advice, and also a past Ashbrook scholar. Amazing. But also, Tom Whatman is from my new favorite small town in Ohio, Belleville. How many been to Belleville? A lot of you have been to Belleville. Man, oh man, what a great place. I can't wait to go back next week to Belleville. It is a really, really great place to be. You have no idea how meaningful this is to me. Peter, I, as you know, represent Johnstown, Ohio, the home of John Ashbrook. I never knew John Ashbrook. I didn't get involved in politics until after John Ashbrook passed. But I know his widow, Jean, who's a supporter. I know his lovely sister, Lucy Tavener, who's been a supporter as well. In fact, Peter, one day you'll appreciate this. At an event in Johnstown that Lucy hosted for me, after the event, she said, I want to talk to you after the event. After the event, she came up to me and she said, I want to give this to you to read this summer. I said, oh, what is it? She said, and I'm holding it in my hand, it's John's diary. Like, oh, I don't want to take this. I mean, it was literally, inside, it was his handwriting, his diary, and I said, I'd love to look at it, but I don't want to take it with me. This is too valuable for me to take. Oh, no, please, take it. Oh, no, I don't want to take it. I will look at it with you here, but I do not want to take something this valuable and this special, John Ashbrook's diary with his own words. What an amazing man he was, and what an amazing tribute to his work, to his life's work, this center is and has become. And so it really is an honor to talk about something that I know was important to him, at least in talking to his widow and to his sister Lucy, and that is reclaiming the American dream. And what do I mean by that? Well, today, poll after poll that I've seen is that a majority of Americans don't believe, that their sons or their daughters will not have a better life than them. That's amazing. Now, my colleague, Bob Gibbs, who's here today, who gets to represent Ashland County and will represent you very well. Speaking for Bob and I think the majority of us in the Republican conference, led by Speaker John Boehner, find that pretty startling, but also kind of depressing. And we want to change that, because that's not the way it's always been. And I want to take you back to my own story to tell you what I mean by that. My dad came here when he was 16 years old, literally on a boat with his older sister, left everything behind, didn't know the language. Why? He came for the American dream. He came because America was the land of opportunity. He was here for 10 years. He ended up in Columbus, Ohio, because he had an aunt here. Toward the end of that 10 years, he was in the Navy, he learned a trade, he became a machinist, got a job in Columbus, but he missed his home, the land of his birth. So he went back. He went back to Italy. He met my mom. After a short courtship, they got married, and he convinced her to come back to America. He was a citizen. She didn't want to come back. She didn't want to come. Her entire family was there. She knew nobody in this foreign land. She didn't know the language. She did not want to come. He convinced her to come. Short time later, their first son was born. Now, in a small village where my mom and dad came from, it was customary, like in many parts of Italy, to name your firstborn son after the paternal grandfather, firstborn daughter after the paternal grandmother. My dad's father's name was Pasquale. So when I was born, my dad wanted to name me Pasquale. So my mom said, I got a deal for you. We name him Pasquale, we're going back to Italy. Otherwise, we do the American version, which is why some people think I'm Irish. So that was the beginning for me. And thank God my parents chose to stay here. Now, I grew up in what would be called today a traditionally ethnic Democrat household. In fact, my mom and dad still have in their family room the bronze bust of John F. Kennedy. We grew up in a very conservative Catholic household. Very conservative Catholic household. Church was the center, one of the centers of our life. Faith, family, friendship, all extremely important growing up in my mom and dad's household. And listen, we didn't have much, but we didn't know that. Not until I started hanging around with some folks who had color TVs and cable. My dad said that wasn't necessary. So it was a great time to grow up. I went to high school and had a government teacher in 11th grade. One of my peers asked him the question, well, how do you know if you're a Republican or a Democrat? 11th grade in public high school in Columbus. Well, you'll be able to know where his philosophy was. His answer was, well, that's simple. If you're white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, your parents belong to a country club, you're a Republican. If you're anything else, you're a Democrat. Well, let me tell you, about 60% white, 40% black was our class. Out of the 60% white, half Catholic, we kind of all looked at each other. None of us had been to a country club before. We were all Democrats. All right? Pretty simple. But that's not really what we were. We didn't know what we were. Well, it was fascinating because we got to see and talk about and study America in high school as it was unfolding before our eyes in the late 1970s, in the early 1980s. What a time. What a time. Think about it. Some of you weren't born back then, but you've learned about it. We had Jimmy Carter. And I remember talking to my dad during the presidential race, Reagan versus Carter. My dad was a Reagan Democrat. Jimmy Carter essentially said, and we talked about it in class for a month, we're just going to have to face up to the facts. America's best days are behind her. essentially is what he said. We have an energy crisis. Wear more clothes. That's essentially what he said. My dad said, that's not why I came to America. Reagan, in that campaign, didn't just win Republican voters, just didn't win conservative voters. He won a collection of voters across the spectrum because of his belief, not in government or centralized government, but his belief in the American people, and that America was a land of great exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. Now, I remember vividly to this day, I was in the marching band at Ohio State in 1984. Ronald Reagan was running for re-election. He was coming to the campus, St. John Arena. We were invited to play at the event. A week before the event, President Jennings, the president of the school, came to our practice and said, I've got bad news. A professor at Ohio State has said that this is a political event, therefore no university assets can be used at this political event. Therefore, the marching band is prohibited from playing. Now, there was just like shock in the room. 225 of us were shocked. And the director said, sorry, that's that. We can't play. One of the senior leaders said, well, how about if we volunteer and we don't use uniforms and we don't use school instruments and we do it on our own time? Well, Dr. Woods said that'd be fine. If you want to get a group of folks to do that, volunteer to do that, that's fine. And I think Dr. Woods was thinking like maybe 20 or 30. A week later at St. John Arena, over 200 of the 225 members of the OSU marching band volunteered to play for President Reagan. Now, I got to tell you, I had one conservative in my 4 years at Ohio State teach me. It wasn't because we had a faculty full of Republicans or conservatives that the marching band members felt as though this was something special. It wasn't as though they all came from Republican households. It was because of what Ronald Reagan believed in. He believed in us as the American people, that we were the drivers of America. It wasn't the government, it was Reagan, who believed it was the people. Now, Reagan was a great president. We all know that. We all agree with that. Even liberals today kind of grudgingly acknowledge that, yeah, he was pretty good. Yeah, for an actor, yeah, he was pretty good. Well, you know what? Think about it. Ronald Reagan, for 8 years, had to work with the Democrat-controlled House. And as Barbara and I were talking earlier, if you go back and look at his record closely, there are some things that Reagan did that in isolation you'd kind of scratch your head and, well, why would he do that? Well, Reagan had a great gift. And that gift was looking at the bigger picture, not the small battles every day in Washington, but the greater good of leading a movement, not just a political movement, but a movement based upon policy and ideology and something much greater than himself, something much greater than government. And that's a battle that we as Republicans face today in Washington, D.C., that Speaker Boehner, who Tom works for, certainly understands when we don't control all of government. We got to look at the greater good and the greater fight. And Reagan did that in such an amazing way because he, as president, could not only communicate with that bully pulpit, but he could motivate. He could motivate like no other. But he believed in American exceptionalism. He believed that we were endowed, that we are endowed by a creator, by our creator, with certain rights. Now, President Obama seems to have missed that point in the recent debates over religious freedom. But he's missed that point a lot because he has a very, very different worldview, as do many progressives. A very different worldview about where those rights come from and who knows best. And it's amazing because we are special. Not me, not you. We are special. We live in a special place. I'll never forget, in 2001, when I got sworn in for the very first time, my aunt, the one who came here with my dad's older sister, who's now probably in her mid-80s, she came over and hugged me afterwards and cried, and she said, I still remember when your father and I came over here. This is such a tribute to him that you've been able to do this. But even bigger than that is my mom's younger brother, who's a lawyer in Rome. And one of his daughters wants to come to law school here in America. Came to my swearing in and said, Pat, you have no idea. You have no idea how big this is. If you were born in Italy and grew up there, if your parents never left, it would be more difficult for you to get elected to the highest law of the land there than it is here as a first-generation American. Now, I'm not saying that that's something great about you, and he didn't mean it that way. What he meant to say was, this is something great about your country. America is special. It's a special system of government by the people. You need to recognize that, celebrate that, appreciate that. Not everybody has that. In fact, nobody else has that. As some in our country want to racist toward Western Europe, there are people in Western Europe who quietly will say, we love what you have. You have something very, very, very special. Well, America is a place where a lot of things happen, and our founding fathers set up a system that we should protect and preserve every chance we get. Because there's something that we believe as conservatives, as Republicans, that is far different than what the president believes and what liberals believe, and that's the reason why Mom and Dad came here, an opportunity. Do they believe not about an equal opportunity, but equal outcomes? Now, Bob Gibbs has been there a year and 2 months. Right, Bob? Shocking, isn't it? I mean, think about it. Obamacare, equal outcomes. Stimulus, crony capitalism, prop up one industry, Solyndra, at the expense of another, the oil and gas industry. This happens every day. This happens across the board, across every agency that the president touches. Central planning, forced unionization, telling a private company, you can't move jobs from one part of America to another part of America. A private company. I still can't believe it. In America. In America. Regulations that punish your enemies and reward your friends. Political speech that creates envy and division. Envy and division in America from the leader. That's not the household that I grew up in with my immigrant parents. Envy and division? No, that's not America. But it's everywhere what this administration touches. Well, you hear it every day with respect to the tax code. I see it every day as a member of the Ways and Means Committee. Let's tax the haves more for the have-nots. Well, how far do you go? In America today, the top 3% pay as much as the rest of the 97% in income taxes. Let me say that again. The top 3% pay as much as the rest of the 97% in income taxes. And about half of Americans don't pay the income tax. And some of those who don't pay, who work, get a check back. Not the America that I grew up in. And if you could only see what the president talks about, or what his folks talk about, their vision of tax reform beyond what you hear at the 30,000-foot level. I remember growing up as a kid in Columbus, walking to school, smelling the hops from the Anheuser-Busch brewery. If you've ever been to Columbus, 270 I-71, it's still there. When I grew up, Anheuser-Busch was an American company. In fact, it was always going to be an American company, right? Budweiser, beer, American. Wow. If someone would have woke me up from a coma and said, Anheuser-Busch is a European company now, owned and operated and headquartered in Europe, I wouldn't believe it, partly because of our tax code. And there are others who aren't here because of our regulatory environment. Now, if you can move, you move. Some can't move. They're just not in business anymore. I was meeting with a guy in Columbus a couple years ago. He was in the middle of a healthcare debate. I won't tell you his name, but it's just an amazing story. He and his wife had a pretty good living. He was in sales. They lived fine. They lived in Dublin, Ohio. He'd always wanted to own a restaurant. It was just kind of in him. Always wanted to do it. Knew the odds were low. Tough business. But in the late 90s, he decided to take a chance. If I told you the name of the restaurant, you'd know it. Most of you'd know it. So in the late 90s, they started a little business in their garage, a little catering business in their garage. 10 years later, I'm having this discussion with him. He has hundreds of employees, works like a dog, has been very successful. He said to me, Pat, I never imagined, and again, this is going on during the healthcare debate, that I would look back over the last 10 years of my success, and if somebody asked me, would you do this? If you knew now what you knew then, would you do this? Would you start it all over? And he said, no, I wouldn't. It's gotten so much more difficult. And this has just hit it out of the park for me. This bill will cause me, if it becomes law, a tremendous amount of headaches in terms of growing my business, maybe even keeping the number of people that I have. I might be able to because of the economies of scale. But this is just the latest in another salvo from the federal government, another regulation that's just going to make it more difficult for me to do a job. Hundreds of people work for this guy, successful in every other way in the marketplace, except for his biggest fight. His biggest fight isn't getting customers. His biggest fight is the federal bureaucracy and federal laws. He just wanted an opportunity. That's all. He didn't want anything, anybody. Now, I was in Zanesville last week, another new part of my district, and I met with a man and a woman. They, too, had never been in the restaurant business. And they own 3 restaurants, much smaller. He said to me, he said, Pat, business is great. You know, we're working 6 days a week, my wife and I. It's like a family with our folks here. Do you think if you guys win the White House and you win the Senate, you'll be able to repeal the president's health care bill? And I said, we're going to sure try. And we've already repealed a couple pieces of it. Actually, last week, slush fund that Tom Harkin had put in, the Louisiana Purchase you might have heard about, another provision we repealed. Got to get 60 votes, but we're going to try. And even if we have to do it slice by slice, we're going to try. He said, I sure hope you do, because when that fully goes into effect, we're going to have to make a decision whether we can stay open or not. And that means 50 people are going to lose their jobs. Now, my accountant said maybe we should try to sell it, but that wouldn't be fair to the person trying to buy it who didn't understand what it was going to mean to them. That's a true American. Not the America that I grew up in. Now, I remember my dad, when I turned 16 years old, got my first job at McDonald's. Great experience. Teaches you a lot about people. My dad said, you need to save a little bit of each paycheck. I said, Dad, I only make $2 an hour. I'm not going to save a little bit from each paycheck. Well, you know what? You can. I did. But you have to understand and want to do it. But my dad said, more importantly, you know, son, we live in the greatest country in the world, but we have a really crazy tax system. You get taxed when you earn it, which is fine. But then you get taxed when you save it and invest it, which is crazy. And then if you're lucky enough to cobble together enough to give to a son or a daughter, you get taxed when you die. That's just crazy. But that shouldn't stop you from trying to do the right thing. What a great lesson from an immigrant father with the 6th grade education, who was a machine operator. The irony now that I sit on the tax committee and chair the subcommittee on taxes and have to deal with Tim Geithner, who has a very different worldview. Very different worldview. And my mom and dad don't have enough money to pass on. That wasn't the point. That wasn't the point. You all know the point. It's about how America is different. How you, the American people, is where the power should be. Not a centralized government that picks winners and losers. America's better than that. And we must fight for that. Because America was made great not by people in Washington, not by great politicians. Oh, sure, Reagan helped a lot. But he'd be the first to say that the people who made us who we are the American people. The entrepreneurs, the risk takers, somebody who had an idea and who had nothing but the idea and went out, sold the idea, and made millions. The person who came here with nothing, literally nothing, risked it all, left behind everything. Where'd they go? They didn't go to Mexico. They didn't go to Canada. They didn't go to Japan. They didn't go to France. They came to America. That's the history. 200 years. They came here. Equal opportunity to succeed or fail, not equal outcomes. Not equal outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the fight today. That's the fight that we're having in Washington, D.C. Where do we go? Well, I would say we go here. We go back to where my mom and dad, when they came to America, that shining city on the hill. Lights flickered on that city on the hill back in the late 70s came shining back in the 80s. Ladies and gentlemen, it's flickering again. But we can turn those lights back on. And at the same time, with your help, we can reclaim America, and we can reclaim the American dream. God bless you. Thank you for having me today.
Is it working now?
Yeah.
A couple of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
The first question I have is from a music aficionado, and he wants to know when you played the trumpet.
Huh.
This will be the most difficult question you get. Were you ever able to play either St. Louis blues or West End blues?
I played St. Louis blues more than once.
Good man. That was my question.
Wow.
West End blues, of course, nobody can play like Louis Armstrong. So.
Wouldn't even try.
Here's the first question. What will it take for Obamacare to be defeated? Will Congress be able to repeal it, or will we have to hope that the Supreme Court strikes it down?
Well, I think there's a good opportunity that the Supreme Court will strike down the individual mandate, which many scholars believe is the kind of the glue that keeps the whole thing together. We in the House have already repealed it. Bob Gibbs and I both voted to repeal it. We have voted to repeal other sections of it. We will vote to repeal it again at the beginning of the next Congress. The question, of course, is who will be president and what will the Senate do? If you watch Washington long enough, the problem is always the Senate, by the way. But I am confident that the Supreme Court will do something to at least begin the process to undo it. And then we're just going to have to work like mad to do the rest of it, undo the rest of it.
Thank you.
But it won't be easy.
Next question. Should America have a flat tax?
You know, I would love to have well, first of all, I'd love to have anything but what we have today. And the problem within the Republican ranks is you have, in the Congress, you have, I would say probably a dozen members in the House that are for a fair tax, a national sales tax, and nothing else. And then you have another about equal amount that are for a flat tax or nothing else. I think either of them are far superior than what we have today. The problem is getting enough of our folks to agree where to go. I think the better potential outcome is a flatter tax than what we have today. Fewer rates, broaden the base. And what I mean by that is you get rid of the loopholes and the credits and dividends that are all over the tax code today, and maybe just have a few and have fewer rates. I just think it's probably difficult to get to a complete flat tax. I'd love to be there. It'd be simple. And by the way, think about it. The next time somebody says to you, a flat tax isn't fair, probably voted for Obama. A flat tax isn't fair. Well, again, my dad. If you make $50,000 and there's a flat tax, you're going to pay a lot less than the person who made $500,000 under a flat tax. Sometimes people don't understand that. So whether you pay, let's say the flat tax is 20%, you pay a heck of a lot more on that 20% at $500,000 than $50,000. It's pretty progressive. But having said that, anything we have is better than what we have today. If we can get it flatter and broaden the base, simplify it, I'd be all for that.
Thank you. First, a comment from this person. Congratulations on running your office efficiently and 14% under budget, I think. The question is, what does the government have to do to prevent the U.S. from a Greece-like default crisis? And how much time do we have?
Well, let me tell you, I'll just cut to the chase on this. It's our entitlement programs. It's our mandatory spending. When John F. Kennedy was president, you had mandatory spending, entitlement spending, approximately a third of our government spending. And 2/3 was discretionary, what Congress and the president control on a year-in, year-out basis. Today, it's flipped. It's a third discretionary, what we control, and 2/3 entitlement, mandatory, which automatically grows. So if we only deal with the discretionary, and in fact, Bob Gibbons and I both supported Speaker Boehner in pushing the president to cut discretionary spending for the first time since World War II. Now, we should celebrate that, but then at the same time recognize, well, guess what? The deficit still went up. Why? Because of mandatory spending. And the beast within mandatory spending is Medicare. And let me say very clearly, we are not going to cut your Medicare, ladies. We are not going to do that. My mom and dad would kill me. However, we have to have a Medicare system, and we have to talk about this. We can't be afraid to talk about it. We have to have a Medicare system that is not dysfunctional. We have a dysfunctional system today. Ask any doctor who participates in Medicare. It doesn't work right. Ask my mom, who's had now her third doctor on Medicare, because the other two doctors stopped providing Medicare. Why? Because it's dysfunctional. It doesn't work right. And by the way, that's not even getting into the demographics issue. The demographics issue are going to kill us. You can't have a society where people live longer, which is a good thing, by the way. We should celebrate that. People live longer, some retire sooner, they're on the system longer, and there are fewer people paying into the system and more people going into the system at the same time. There are fewer into the system. As I look around the room to these young men and women, some in high school, some in college, when I go talk to young people, I say, you know what? You need to be engaged. You need to be engaged because Medicare and Social Security are systems that will not be there for you unless you engage today. Because the actuaries, not political people, the numbers people who look at those programs and work for those programs say they are not sustainable. You can't raise taxes enough on rich people to sustain those two programs. You will not have doctors providing Medicare if we don't change it. You just won't. People are going to continue to live longer. You got to change the systems. I want to make sure that Medicare and Social Security are there for my kids, but I don't want to leave them paying the bill for everybody else. So what we are going to do as House Republicans is what we did under Speaker Boehner's leadership last year, and that's pass a budget that begins us down the road of putting market forces into our Medicare system, which will make it a system that will last a lot longer, be more efficient, get physicians back engaged in a Medicare system. I just got a letter from a doctor in Mansfield, and I'm going to talk to Secretary Sebelius is coming before the Ways and Means Committee next week. She sent me this letter last week, copied the president, and she said, Mr. President, with respect to Medicare and your health care bill, I will no longer be able to practice in Mansfield, Ohio with seniors because I am going to stop accepting Medicare patients. Now, and I have so many letters like that. If we're not going to listen to physicians who are on the front lines of this, shame on us. We have to do it. Unfortunately, the other side is going to try to scare you all that we're trying to throw Granny out in the cold. And let me tell you, my mom would pull me up by the ears if I did that. It's just not going to happen. We have to save it, not just for our seniors, but for our kids.
Thank you. We have a couple questions that are political questions, so we have a few more minutes left. First one is, why do you think Congress has such a low approval rating?
Well, we deserve it, quite frankly.
Okay, let's move on.
No, well, listen, it's ugly. It's ugly. It's as ugly as ever. But by the way, when it was ugly back in the 1960s, or ugly back in the 1930s, or quite frankly, ugly back in the 1980s, we didn't see it 24 hours a day. Today, we see it in real time. You see it in real time. And I have my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, who get called on to, you name the network, MSNBC, Fox News, Bloomberg, whatever, C-SPAN. Well, if they talk about things that are kind of boring to all of you, like my speech, they're not going to go back on there again because they won't be called back on there again. The people who go on there are the ones who are kind of lighting it up, right? I mean, they're throwing bombs, both at the president or at Speaker Boehner. Maxine Waters. You see Maxine Waters on TV a lot. She called Boehner a demon last week. You'll see her on there more. So, well, I guess what I'm saying is technology, which is a wonderful thing, has kind of opened up the Congress for everybody to see, the good and the bad. We're fighting a president who we do not agree with his policies. And so that means we're not going to be singing Kumbaya. I mean, that's just a fact. We're going to fight. Now, we should fight respectfully, I believe. We should fight without being totally disagreeable. We could do it in a humane, respectful way, in a faith-filled way. We can do that. Not everybody does that. But 100 years ago, or maybe 200 years ago, Peter, you correct me, I mean, they would walk out of the Capitol and have a fist fight, and sometimes even with guns. So they didn't have cable news back then, and the Drudge Report. But my point is, it's always been this way. It's just a little bit more exposed today, and so we've got divided government, and so we're at loggerjams. That's what the Founding Fathers set up. We shouldn't be depressed about it, but I understand why it's 10%.
Thank you very much. I'm going to roll through three questions that are related.
Okay.
You go ahead and do what you like with them, and then we'll have to end. Out of the many people running for office of president, who in your professional opinion and based on your political experience is the one who can win over the people to get America back on the track? That's one. Second, related, how can Republicans win Reagan Democrats this election? The last, regardless of who the candidate ends up being, what do the Republicans have to do to successfully recapture the White House this fall?
Well, I'll start with the last question. I think that we have to put everything in perspective, and sometimes you lose that perspective if you go back to question one, and you watch the news. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And let me just tell you, there is no Ronald Reagan in this presidential field. I'm bummed out about that. I'm sure many of you are bummed out about that. But we have to put it in perspective. Any one of our candidates would be preferable than the current occupant in the White House. That's how we have to look at it. And so I'll answer, I guess, the first one by saying I haven't decided who I'm going to vote for yet, but any of them would be preferable, and we have to make the argument to our friends, to other conservatives, to independent voters, that Republicans have a better belief system in how America should go forward. And it goes to what my speech was all about. Whether it's Ron Paul, Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, Mitt Romney, they all believe, I believe they all believe, that you all in this room have a better idea of how to make America work than some bureaucrat in the White House who believes they know better about how Ashland, Ohio should work. Now, I don't agree with what all four of them say. You know, if I were up here today and I could say something to Mitt Romney, I would say, you know what? How am I supposed to defend success in America when you can't defend success in America? and you know, he's our front runner. I think the guy who probably appeals most to Reagan Democrats, based upon Reagan Democrats I've talked to, is Rick Santorum. And I think part of it's his upbringing of where he came from and how he can relate to that. And Rick, who I know very well, and I thought was a long shot, and now I guess he's not as long a shot as he was. This is, and you know, Tom and I have talked about this. One of the things I think that has hurt Romney in his role as the front runner is that, unlike at times Gingrich, who has obviously struggled as well, and at times Ron Paul, who's a very nice man who I serve with, but I think Rick's the best at it. He is sincere, and you can tell he believes what he's saying, and he really has a belief in American exceptionalism. And I think that appeals to Reagan Democrats. That's just not a conservative ideal. It's an American ideal that I believe we as conservatives really not only believe in, but we govern like it, because we believe in the American people. And I think Rick has the ability to appeal to those people because of how he projects it better than the rest of them.
Thank you very much for your talk and those thoughtful answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.